My name is Chia-Ta Lee. I'm just what Junji just mentioned. I'm an environmentalist in Taiwan, leading several social movements for like 5 years. And I'm also a graduate student in National Childhood University. First of all, I would like to thank to all the staff and professors in East Asian Legal Study, especially for the coordinator, Junji. It's you that make this all possible, and I have really a very good time here. And also, I have to thank to all of my lovely and friendly colleagues who helped me to explore my physical limits last Sunday. So, yeah, I just want to thank you for letting me have this great time here. And today's topic is about the Environmental Impact Assessment Act in Taiwan, which plays a major part of the environmental politics, because we have a very different and powerful legislation than any other places in the world. That which just make an example is that what we stipulate in this act, we call the EIA Act. Whenever there is a concern of adverse impact on the environment, any kind of development can be rejected by the environmental protection agencies. In other words, the EPA has the power to reject any proposal by the central government or by any parties. So that was a very powerful legislation. But who can evaluate and give the definition of what the concern it is? So that was the key issue. And as a matter of fact, as the statistic reports, over near 90% of the development cases in the EIA raise no concern at all. So even we have a very strict EIA law, but we don't enforce it very well. So I call it an impact assessment without impact. And you can show the empirical study in today's talk. So in case you don't know where Taiwan is, but I think everyone's very familiar with that. It was a very small dot in the global map, but it's a very beautiful island. Actually, Taiwan is a combination of quite a variety of cultural biological diversity. And we have a very different landscape from a tropical rainforest, and we also have over 100 mountains that over 3,000 meters high altitude, so we can have snow as well in the tropical area. And we have a very beautiful combination of culture, like the indigenous people, Chinese culture, and Japanese culture, and Portuguese, Spain, and every colonial culture. So that was a beautiful place. If you have chances to visit, please come to Taiwan. Yeah. And okay, here comes today's story. That's what I taught here for several environmental law classes, and I talked to several environmental law professors. And also, what I really experienced in the real life. I think environmental law was really tricky things that was due to its complexity. It was highly political driven, and all the product that the environmental legislation will be under numerous negotiation, no matter it's on the table or on the table, and it was full of compromise by different parties struggling with each other. So we don't have a perfect environmental law, and even we can't enforce it as what is stipulated in the articles. So is the case of the EIA, because the EIA was originated from the U.S., the National Environmental Protection Act in 1970, and the key concept of the NEPA in the U.S. was to provide. This was is kind of first gatekeeper to disclose the information that the development will going to cause the impact on the environment. And that was the first gatekeeper, because once the NEPA provided information that the development may have an impact on the environment, that would be trigger other law like Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, so the environmental group or the court can have some actions to that. So after 1970, the U.S. have the NEPA Act, the NEPA, and then the world have the trend to enact the so-called environmental impact assessment. So is Taiwan. But what's a little special in Taiwan is that during the 1980s, we had a grassroots environmental protest movement swept through the Taiwan and formed a very strong social force, because there was several serious environmental pollution cases that lead to a great casualty, to some deaths and property loss. So we have a very strong social awareness acts to the government, we so-called the always ruling party KMT at that time in 1994, to make a very huge reform on its democratic and environmental governance structure. So because we have combined with the political movement leading by the DPP, that was the opposition party at that time, so we have a huge success to enact this very, very powerful legislation of the EIA in Taiwan. So because like the NEPA in US, the key concept is to provide information. So no matter how the development is going to destroy the environment, the EPA in the United States can't use NEPA to reject the development. But in Taiwan we can. The EPA can reject all the development activities that only raise the concern, because they haven't done it yet, only raise the concern of the impact concern to the environment. So that was a very powerful idea. And what's more, the EIA Act in Taiwan, they introduced a so-called a special commission. This special commission who reviewed the EIA in Taiwan was composed of 2/3 outside the independent expert, which means that under the EPA, there was a special commission for the EIA to do the examination that was composed of 2/3 so-called independent expert or professional, like a university professor. So that's how our EIA was enacted, and it's very different from the US and any other places in the world. And also, the EIA Act has helped to social movement transition, because now the NGOs, they think that we used to be outside this institution. We have to do the protest and demonstration and going on the street and to release our claims to the government. But now we can get into the institution inside the EPA, and the EPA can have their authority to reject the proposal. So now every environmental movement go into the institution in the EIA procedure. So that was another huge change. As you can see from the comment, but there's always, as I mentioned before, there was always a political reality issue. As you all always know that Taiwan is really a center of high technology manufacturing and for some high pollution industry like chemicals, petroleum, and cement. So the government always have to confront these conflicts that if they want to promote a good investment environment or a good nature environment, that was always being a conflicting ideas. So even though we have this so strict environmental legislation of the EIA, more than stricter than any other places in the world, in reality, the politics, they can enforce that act in that regard. So as you can see from the comics, it's in the year 2000, the DPP, the opposition party, the first time they came into office and win the presidential election. And we have our first minister of EPA was from a very famous environmentalist. So that was the person, Mr. Chung. Mr. Chung, that was from a very famous environmental NGOs, a very radical one. And he's trying to play the gatekeeper of the environmental politics. And those so-called his enemies was from the alliance of the high pollution industries, and they're whispering that who can tell him, in fact, we are the same king. And actually, as a matter of fact, after the 8 years of the DPP administration, you can see that no matter the DPP or the KMT, they are always in line with those industry, not really in favor of the environmental groups. So even though we have a very strict Environmental Impact Assessment Act, we don't enforce it very strict. So that was the political reality. So let's talk about some ideas about the EIA. The idea of the EIA is to prevent and mitigate the adverse impact of development activities. So, which in other words, we do it beforehand. The harm of the development doesn't really happen yet. And when we should do the EIA, in our EIA Act, whenever you raise a concern of adverse impact, you have to conduct the EIA. What kind of concern are we mentioning here? Like, if your development is located in a national park, if it's located in a wildlife preserve area, or an important habitat, or a water catchment area, you raise this kind of concern, and it was a list. And if you raise a special significant concern, you have to conduct a phase 2 EIA. That was much more stricter because they have to have public hearing, they have to rescoping the whole questions with the different interest parties, and they have to raise their feasible alternative plan. So that was the phase 2, but we call it a substantial EIA in the phase 2. And where should conduct the EIA? It depends on the scale, depends on the location and category. So you may go to the central government's EPA, or you can go to the local government's Environmental Protection Bureau. And who will do the EIA explanation? As I just explained to you, there will be a special commission composed of 2/3 independent professionals outside the agencies. So, and what will be included in the EIA, like air, water, species protection, soil, noise, vibration, everything that you can imagine. So that was very inclusive. So as you can see from this chart, from this slide, it seems good for this EIA procedure because it included everything and have a very independent body to review that. But then how it really works? This chart, a very complicated chart, you can see a very dynamic environmental politics in Taiwan. A very general process was that because most of the development activities that will raise the concern to the level of EIA required is from the government, like a highway or a dam, something like that. So most of the developing activities was from the government. So if the executive branches of our government want to have a highway or some activities, they will attribute like the Minister of Transportation to be the developer and have the proposal of establishment of that highway. And of course, they would raise the concern of adverse impacts, so they have to conduct the EIA. And then the developers here have to submit a scientific report we call the environmental impact statement to disclose what the impact that activities will cause and that report will go into the EPA. The EPA will hand that report to the commission. That was a special commission. And then they will decide whether to approve it, reject it, or ask them to go to the phase 2. So what's the problem here? Okay, the first problem is that you can see, I call it who is the boss problem. According to our constitution, the highest level of our executive branches was our administrative yuan, and the EPA was under the administrative yuan. If you make the minister of administrative yuan was the boss, and the minister of EPA was his staff. So in this structure, the staff, the minister of EPA, can reject the proposal from his boss. So in reality, will that works? That was the first question. And second question is that who really should bear the responsibility under this legal framework. Because though it was very powerful, it's not really in accordance with the idea of democratic politics. Because the Minister of Administrative Yuan was directly appointed by the president, who is elected by the general public. But now, a special commission who is from like National Taiwan University or from some consulting company, they can reject the proposal proposed by the Minister of Administrative Yuan. So, yes.
What is the Administrative Yuan?
Yeah, that was we call the 行政院, and it's like our Prime Minister in Taiwan. Yes. So that was the highest executive branches in Taiwan. So they make all the decisions just under the. Yes, we have a president. Yeah. So actually, they have a different authority according to our constitution.
Well, the president is elected, but the prime minister, the so-called president of the executive yuan, can undertake day-to-day operations. And therefore, some people criticize it for obscuring the democratic responsibility. Who is the boss? Theoretically, it's the president, not the administrative yuan. But the constitution still has a clause saying that the executive yuan is the highest authority in this country.
So, and in the EIA structure, there is another question that even we think that the president of the administrative yuan should be politically responsible for all the policies they make. But now, an agency under the administrative yuan, one was the EPA, can reject or reverse the proposal by the administrative yuan. And the decision making was from a special commission. And those commissioner was from outside the agencies, we so-called independent professional. So a lot of constitutional scholars think that the EIA Act is really breaching the gap or breaching the principle of the separation of power. So that was the second part. Who should bear the responsibility? And as you can imagine that if the president in his campaign, in his election campaign, he proposed to have a highway construction. And after he was elected, and he asked the administrative yuan to enforce that project to have a highway. And then the EPA under the administrative yuan, and they have a conclusion that the highway is not appropriate for the environment. So the project was being denied in the EIA. So who should be responsible for that? That was the second question. And the third question is that if on the appearance they have such powerful authority, what will be the check and balance system to balance this power? Will the court or will the Congress play that role? And in that case, we think that both of the court and Congress, they can play no roles here, because as you may notice that Taiwan is a civil law system that we have adopted the German administrative law. So if the civil society want to use the court to balance the decision making here, they have to convince the court that they have standing in the first place. But under the so-called civil law system, we are really hard to get standing in the EIA case because the development activity doesn't happen yet. It was the evaluation of whether we can conduct this construction. So the harmless doesn't happen yet, and we don't get standing. And even our standing was admitted by the court. The court will further think that they should defer this to the professional expertise in the EPA. So that they intend to defer this case back to the EPA rather than taking the opinion from civil society. So the court can play a really weak role. And Congress, in Germany, they have a very strong Green Party, but we don't have Green Party we have Green Party, but we rather weak one because we don't have any seats in Taiwan's Congress. So we don't have influence in the Congress to do that. And as you can see from the outcome is that over nearly 90% of the case, they will be approved in the so-called phase 2 EIA examination. In other words, from the perspective of the EIA Act, those activities, development activities, which raise the concern of adverse impact, doesn't raise any other significant impact, so they don't have to go to phase 2. So, which means that they just easily be approved in that regard. And what about the civil society's participation? We can go to the court. We can win the election in the Congress. So how can we join this part? No, because only in the phase 2 they provide public hearings opportunities for us to participate. So in principle, in the phase 1 examination, it was a secret meeting. They have their legal basis to reject your participation from the civil society. So this act, though it looks very powerful, it turned out to be the civil society have no way to participate, and the court plays no role, the Congress plays no role. There was no check and balance system. So then comes my empirical study. So like this petroleum refinery plant, I read his EIS, the statement, the scientific report. It says that they don't have any air pollution impact on the environment at all. Why? Because they think that the area they want to build a plant has already been highly polluted, so they don't have extra or margin pollution there. So here's my empirical study. First, I would like the question I want to raise here is that I want to discover the overall picture of how the EIA was enforced during the decision-making process. And the second question is that will the political pressure intervene within the decision-making process? And the third question is that is the so-called independent commission really have the capacity to do the examination with what so-called objectivity requirement? And so I have some assumption here to do this empirical study is that I think because the idea of the EIA is to do the assessment before the harm really caused by the harm was really generated by the activities. So I think that if the for every development activity which is already required to conduct the EIA, is already within the minimum concern of the damage to the environment. And so what we expect to see in their EIS, the report, they have to be honest about what impact they will produce. And then we can believe that, oh, okay, you have this kind of impact. So what is your mitigation strategy? So I think that was a reasonable EIA process. But in other words, if they don't disclose their impact honestly in the report, so we can expect in the following process, they will be very objective. So I think so this check is going to be if there will be a bias in the statement proposed by the developer. So we go into every EIS within these 10 years. It's totally 339 samples under the central government EPA jurisdiction. And those cases are in a large scale and in a large, and in a very, and most of the cases it's really raised a significant concern of the environment. So we read the statement and the report, and we found that over near 80% of the development activities concerns that they have no impact or minimal impact or even positive impact on the animals. So over 80% of our development activities have no impact, minimum impact, or even positive impact on our animals. And nearly 75% of our development activities raise no impact, minimum impact, or positive impact to our air. These two indicators, I just make it for examples. And we can tell from the result is that most of the statement reveals that their activity, their development activities doesn't have impact on the environment at all. So if they don't admit that they will impact the environment in the first place, and we don't expect that they will have a very honest mitigation strategy. So I think there will be bias inside the, there will be bias for their writing the report. So that was the first part of our empirical study. And the second part is about the capacity of this so-called independent commission. And after our study, we think that they don't really have the capacity to do the so-called independent examination. First of all, they are hired only part-time, without regular pay. So they have a full-time job in the weekday, like a university professor. And second, they don't have any research assistant. So they have to do the evaluation or to read the hundreds of pages report on their own. And they will receive a new EIS or new case of hundreds of pages every 2.6 days. And they have to make a decision in every 9 days. So in that case, we think that an ordinary person who is not going to stay up to reading all this material can never complete this kind of examination. So they don't really have the capacity to do that with so-called independence examination. And the third part is that we do the in-depth interview and survey with those commissioners. And all of them, more than half who returned the survey, and all of them think that the EIS report is really with bias. And according to our in-depth interview, they think that they all intervened by some degree of the political pressure. So, yeah, by our empirical study, then we can just be sure about our assumption that this EIA Act really have a powerful legislation, but didn't enforce very well.